Oh, oh, oh. Hi, friends. Hi, friends. Hello, hello, hello. Okay, okay, okay. Appreciate the brave souls sitting in front. Welcome. Okay. Hey, y'all, it's 11 o'clock. We're going to go ahead and get started. Uh, we're glad to see you, and we're happy to have this conversation with you. My name is Philip Nevels, partner for post-secondary programs at Catalyst Ed, and Catalyst Ed is the backbone for the higher ed equity network. And so today, we'll have a brief conversation about what the network is, how we work, some of our aims, but then we'll have an opportunity to go much more in depth about one of the work streams, thinking about equitable investment in higher ed, what that means in terms of our students, the sector as a whole, and some of the policy recommendations that have come out of that. And so just to give you an overview on how the session will go, again, I'll do a quick intro. My colleague Monica from Achieving the Dream, our colleague Charles from CCA, and Kristen McGuire from Young Invincibles will then have about a 30-minute conversation. We'll leave about 10 minutes for questions and dialogue at the end of all this. Sound good? Okay. So I said, the Higher Ed Equity Network is a collective impact network that is explicitly focused on improving outcomes of Black, Latino, and Indigenous students. And it's made up of nearly 30, 40 organizations, many are again who are represented right here, CCA being one of our core partners in that. And when we think about the scope of that, that represents about 12 million students, about 1,600 institutions, and essentially covers all 50 states. And as we do this collective work, one of the things to note is that we try to address issues and challenges that not a single organization can address on their own. That means cross-sector partnerships. That means working with the federal government. That means work with state CEOs. That means working with higher ed intermediaries, working with institutions, right, to solve really big, ambitious, challenging problems. And when we think about this, we organize our work around a shared theory of change. And the reality is that the sort of bilateral, multilateral partnerships are still necessary. Organizations still have to work together. But imagine what it looks like when you have 40 organizations in the entirety of the sector saying 1, 2, 3, push to make really substantial impact in higher ed. That's how we are thinking about our work, and that's what we're doing. We're also thinking about building the capacity of the organizations who are part of the network. Essentially, these things all connect to one another. When the network does work, our organizations learn. When they learn, they can support their institutions and support their leaders. They can feed those learnings right back to the network as we think about how to scale those things across the space. And so I have certainly been excited to see that in action and to see where we're going, okay? So this is a slide of many organizations who are part of this. Again, I'll skip ahead a little bit. I want to share about what we believe, that an explicit focus on race or racial equity in higher ed is necessary. I want to use one example. We're all familiar with much of the work around transfer and credit recognition, but even after decades of work across the sector, the outcomes for Black, Latino, Indigenous students still lag behind significantly relative to other populations, right? And so what we are saying here is that we can't solve really big, hairy issues unless we also include the lens of racial equity in race, and that we can't have race-neutral solutions to be able to solve these things in higher ed. The second part, college success does not end at graduation. You've heard many speakers over the course of these 2 days talk about economic and sociability. Those things are still core. It is at the core of our work and how we see our outcomes. I do want to acknowledge, though, the conversation around social and economic mobility that is not inflating the hyper-capitalist system in a way that then harms the same students that we're saying we're supporting. And we also recognize that in those communities, there are a variety of needs and a variety of things in terms of looking at community health that are not always articulated in social and economic mobility. But again, our end goal is around improving social and economic mobility for those student populations. The third point, if I can see it here, is that racial inequities have to be addressed through systemic solutions. Again, this is not a new concept, but this is the core of who we are. The reality is that when you have one-off approaches, sometimes they're inefficient. Sometimes they cost a lot. Sometimes we are duplicating efforts in the field. Sometimes we don't know what the other partners are doing, even though we're working with the same institutions. And so one of the points of the Higher Ed Equity Network is to try to address this specific problem, again, to be able to do this at scale and to be able to do this in a way that has the greatest impact possible, given many of the leaders who were around the table and the resources that we have. Certainly, it requires bringing in philanthropy. Certainly, it requires bringing in governmental entities to, again, be able to address the systems that interconnect and cross-connect with education. So, how we work. Last year at CCA, we did a short presentation introducing the network. One of the questions is, so what does that look like? What are the issues that y'all are focusing on? And so this slide is to give you just a little bit of overview on what we've been doing since last year at CCA. So I'm gonna go backwards, or at least from right to left. Mobilizing. For us, that means mobilizing around an action agenda that is changing ideas, changing policies, changing the way that institutions do work. Again, this idea of saying 1, 2, 3, push, where all the organizations that are part of the network can move a thing forward faster than if we were working alone by ourselves. The second part around amplifying, that is the idea that a network can collect what is the best of the best around practices, approaches that relate to racial equity in higher ed. But to be able to do that, it also requires alignment. In this case, this is saying many of the partners in the room, what's happening in the field? What are we doing? What states are we working across? Again, what do we learn? What are the gaps? And I recognize this is an oversimplified graphic because the reality is that there are many steps to be able to get from align to amplify to mobilizing across the issue. One of the things that may come up, that's impressive, thanks. No, you're good. One of the things that may show up is that there are gaps in knowledge in the field. And so before we can get to the amplify piece or the mobilize piece, it is the network saying, what are the gaps in the field and how do we educate ourselves, but also educate the sector around the possibilities. I use the example of transfer, actually Charles sits on one of those working groups. At the fundamental level, there was a question asked, what do we know about, again, how transfer and credit recognition policies are affecting outcomes for Black students or Latino students or Indigenous students? In order to have solutions and approaches, we needed to fundamentally understand that for the field. We needed to understand what the data looks like, again, and put that out in the world and saying, work with us around our action agenda and around some of those recommendations. Another question we asked ourselves as sort of one of the issues we are working on the Higher Equity Network is around how do institutions use data to improve career outcomes? There are a couple of really good examples out there, right? In the field, part of what this amplification of that looks like is being able to share out to the world and into the sector and tell folks this is what needs to be true, or this is some of the things that we saw that were true for those institutions to be able to improve career outcomes as it relates to their use of data. Some of that was around technology systems. Some of that was around training. Some of that was around how their organizations were structured. Some of that was around the policy context around and shared data usage, whether at the state level or around their system. These are some of the things that we think are critical for higher ed, but also requires a collective effort. And so in a few minutes, our colleague Monica Parrish-Trent, the Vice President at Achieving the Dream, is going to moderate a panel around another work stream that we're working on, again, around equitable investment. And the title is Compounding Inequities. So excited to hear from Monica, excited to hear from Charles, excited to hear from Kristen, and thank you for being here, y'all.
Thank you, Philip, and it's a pleasure to be here with all of you today. I am Monica Parrish-Trent. I'm the Chief Program and Network Officer at Achieving the Dream, which is a national reform network that works with nearly 300 community colleges across the country. We also support 28 of the tribal colleges and universities and have a partnership with the South African university system. I am going to go ahead and get us started with our questions, and I'll begin with Charles, who will tell us a little bit more about himself as he answers the question. So as Philip mentioned, the Higher Ed Equity Network has an upcoming report titled Compounding Inequity that closely examines student loan indebtedness, economic inequity, and a myriad of long-standing racial disparities that continue to block access to social and economic mobility for racially minoritized people. Charles, can you tell us a bit about the issues that are framed by the report and how these issues are interconnected?
I can. Hi, everybody, by the way. I'm Charles Ansell. I'm the Vice President for Research Policy and Advocacy, and I hope they don't mind that I'm going to do this. If the College of Southern Nevada podcasters need anything at all in terms of technical setup, and if you need to put anything up, go for it. I'm so happy you're here. But to answer the question, yeah, super excited about this report that Chris and I, our committee, worked on, and I guess I would say three different things about it. So its comprehensiveness, the problem it's addressing, and the actions that we want to take. So first, it's a comprehensive report, and I mean that two ways. So one is that, as Philip said, the whole point of having a higher ed equity network is to actually bring a lot of organizations together to put something out that's greater than the sum of their parts. And so I think that, this report and hopefully the policy platform and action that comes from it does exactly that. So it's comprehensive in that way. It's comprehensive also in the issues that it's bringing together, which is a byproduct of having lots of organizations co-authoring it, right? And And so that's the first thing, and that leads to the second thing, which is the racial wealth gap, and how this report is using that as the foundation. So when we think about, I admit this is, I don't want to speak totally on behalf of the network, but I think this is fair for our committee, that when we were thinking about this report and what we wanted to address, we were looking at higher education and how it can solve the racial wealth gap, but how it also, frankly, exacerbates it, right? Mm-hmm. So the idea is, we have experts in this committee on things from affirmative action, on student financial aid and student loans, on college completion, on student success and institutional support. And you can kind of trace that out as how affirmative action and just general admissions policies overall and affordability come together to determine how many students are going to be able to benefit from a college education. That in turn predicts how many students are going to graduate. And then that in turn predicts, especially, in the middle of that, you'll have what students have had to take out in terms of student loans and whether they complete their program of study, and that in turn will determine whether we are improving and making a dent on the racial wealth gap, which is $10 trillion, or if we're exacerbating it. So we brought in expertise across a lot of organizations to address that problem in that way, in that flow. And we have recommendations in the report, and we'll get to that, but and frankly, a lot of the sessions here over the past 2 days have kind of covered it in pieces. But then the idea is, okay, so we have all these people, we have all these organizations, they're putting their concepts together, they're trying to solve the hardest problem that we're facing in higher education. So what are the actions that we're going to take? And that leads to the third area, right? What are the policy actions that need to take place? What are the practices that they're steeped in? And what's the evidence base in turn that supports those practices and those policies? So that's what the report's about, and we're proud of it, if I can say that. Yeah.
I think that's a fair assessment.
Yeah.
Is my mic on?
I think it is now.
Okay.
Thank you, Charles. Kristen, I'd love to give you an opportunity to talk a bit about the report, especially the interconnectivity of the work. I mean, we've talked about the racial wealth gap and how if you backwards map that to education, how is it a contributing factor when students are in considerable debt? So if you could talk about the interconnectivity of these issues and how creating a research, practice, and policy agenda that informs the impact of the field and students is a part of your plan and the dissemination of the report.
Sure. So I'm Kristen McGuire. I'm the executive director at Young Invincibles. We're a national policy and advocacy organization for young adults and young adult issues. And we define young adults as 18 to 34 years old. So when we think about the racial wealth gap in higher education and how all of these issues are interconnected, it's really, when you get down to the root of it, it's really the fact that when our schools were integrated and allowed for Black and brown people to attend higher education, the cost skyrocketed at a rate that is consistent with it being causal. And when we think about, Black people, brown people have been told for generations, we are people who are told to bootstrap, pull yourself up, work hard, do your best, go to college. But then we have systems in place that almost penalize us for doing that, right? You can look at the data points. Education costs more for racialized people. We have to take out more student loan debt, which then prevents us from hitting other life milestones or creating wealth as our white counterparts. The purchasing of homes are delayed, starting of families are delayed, and the amount of student debt that we take on increases, not just for the student, but for the family as a whole. So when we look at all of this, how this is interconnected, along with recent Supreme Court rulings as it relates to affirmative action, it just kind of creates a perfect storm, I would say, for racialized groups to be able to enter systems of higher education, complete, and have reduced barriers.
Thank you, Kristen. So one of the benefits of being a part of the Higher Ed Equity Network is that we have very meaningful and engaging conversations about the ways in which higher education impacts particular student populations. And what's central to our mission is that we really are focusing on racial equity and specifically the ways in which Latino students, Black students, and Native American students experience higher education. And Kristen just talked about the impacts of not being able to complete at the same rate as white counterparts and the debt that many of our students are in and that leave with, frankly, debt and without an education. And so I want to talk to Charles in a two-part question, taking these things into consideration. What are some of the most significant policy recommendations that are coming out of the report? That's the first part. And the second part is, what do you foresee as the main challenges to implementing these recommendations at the federal, state, and institutional levels?
Okay, so a few thoughts. So let me start with the first one. I think that, in terms of the policy recommendations that are coming out of this report, I think that there are policy recommendations that deal strongly with colleges that have selective admissions. So going into that, affirmative action piece that we were talking about, what we do in light of the Supreme Court decision, and how we should handle that in terms of, looking at policies around, say, legacy admissions, and also just looking at the size of these colleges. One of the presidents in the panel brought that up or hinted at that earlier this morning, that, we're dealing with colleges that, have a ton of resources. I want to say that the colleges that are selective enrollment, 50% more selectivity rate, have on average 3.5 times more dollars per student than students at community colleges and regional colleges that would have been in the bottom quintile in terms of by income bracket for the students that they serve. So how can we make sure that more elite institutions are stepping up? But frankly, we can't wait on them. We can't hold out for that. We can't wait for the media narrative to change if we're not going to change that ourselves. So then I would say that we're looking at two other categories of policy recommendations. So there's recommendations that are directed, to at the federal and state levels. That's not a portmanteau. Around making sure that we fix affordability. So looking at different ways that we can quantify unmet need, because even when we're able to meet a student's needs in terms of all tuitions and fees being covered, which let me be clear, that's rare, but there are plenty of states, I'm thinking of California, where, we can make college it is pretty affordable. But then what does that look like in terms of housing insecurity, technology insecurity, food insecurity? It's those sorts of costs that drive students to have to attend part-time because they're working a full-time job. And when that happens, Complete College America has said it for 10 years, time is the enemy of college completion. And National Student Clearinghouse just released its updated college completion data for 6-year grad rates, and you can just trace it out, right? At the 4-year institution for 6-year grad rates for 4-year publics, if you attend exclusively full-time, it's about an 80% grad rate. If it's mixed enrollment, it's about 60, and if it's exclusively part-time, it's about a little under 20. In the 2-year sector, it goes 50, 30, 10, from full to mixed to part-time. And again, those are 6-year rates for a 2-year institution. So we need to be better and more wise at financially supporting our students. And I know that takes a lot of investment, but the whole premise of higher education is that you build income and wealth for all. And so it's something that pays itself back. And then the third piece is looking at institutional support. So, if I was just talking about California and as that, sorry, I have tidal waves. If they're, in California, Governor Newsom introduced 70 by 30. We're going to have 70% of our population have credentials of economic value by the year 2030. Georgetown just released their recent report. So the country needs to have 72% of its residents to have credentials of economic value, post-secondary credentials, by the year 2031. How much does that actually cost? We're making these statements, we're having governors avow them, we're having legislators commit to them, but our budgets don't meet those commitments, our budgets don't use those as strategies that reflect towards getting to those commitments, and they don't represent decision-making frameworks for achieving it. So the policy recommendations that are in this report deal with those three categories. What are the elite institutions going to do to hold their part, and we need to hold them to the fire? What are we going to do to make college more accessible to all? And then how are we going to map this all towards college completion goals? So that's the first piece. Obviously, you know, it's an incredibly challenging environment to implement that in terms of, you know, partisan politics and being perceived as naive when you make these statements. I think that there is a myth that higher education doesn't hold itself accountable. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't efficiencies to be gained. Clearly, CCA believes that. I mean, we've got student success reforms as, you know, literal pillars out there in the hallway. I mean, there's definitely things that colleges can be doing to improve ourselves. But, you know, you look at these funding formulas, I mean, I think, you know, you almost give away the lie when you say that community colleges, like in California, have to follow a student success-based formula that the university system doesn't have to follow.
Right.
They just get the same money every time. Or I mean more, let's be clear. So, you know, we need to make sure that we are pairing our funding conversations and success conversations together because I do believe that's a bipartisan thing that works at the state level. And then finally, federally, not only do we have to make sure that we can make state policy talk to federal policy, which is hard. I mean, that was the big rumor going around when free community college was almost a thing, and hopefully that comes back. But I think that right now, everybody that I talk to who's working on federal policy is essentially developing a plan A and a plan B. And I think that into 2024, that's kind of what Future Ready looks like on the federal policy front, is those two plans.
Thank you, Charles. Did you want to add anything, Kristen?
I was just going to add to what you said when we think about the success of students in college, really focusing on that basic needs and wraparound support. Because when we tie it back to the racial wealth gap, it means we're looking to educate the folks who may need the most support on campus. So even with free cost of attendance, we have to focus on what it looks like to take care of the whole student. What does housing look like? What does food look like? And even when we have states like the great state of California, being able to make college a little more affordable, what does it look like to have the infrastructure investments to ensure that we can house the students? What does housing at the community college level look like if we know that that's where students are going? And so those are the types of policy recommendations I think are important for us to continue to advocate for.
Thank you, Kristen. That's a nice segue into the next question. And as we know, for the student populations that we are focusing on, this is their opportunity to make a difference in not only their lives, but in the lives of their families. And so when we think about the strategies that need to be in place to engage those that are most impacted by these issues, students, educators, faculty, and college leaders, and also something one of the panelists said this morning, where we all know that there is somewhat of an assault on higher education and a lot of questioning about the value. But we have to keep our foot on the gas. So what are some strategies for engaging these constituents and these stakeholders, the students, the educators, the faculty, and college leaders, as well as policymakers and thought leaders? It takes the entire ecosystem to create a movement around this work, racial equity in higher education to close wealth gaps. What's it going to take to create a movement, Kristen?
Sure. Well, I can start with the students and young adults, obviously. So this might be too old of a reference for my college students, but FUBU, right? For us, by us. Yes. So we believe at Young Invincibles that we can't create policy for impacted people. We have to do it with impacted people, right? And so that means that we want to involve people who are currently being impacted by our systems of higher education, who are current students and living everything that we're talking about in this report. And so that one thing is about elevating and uplifting the stories of current college students. And sometimes we don't really think about the value of having impacted people tell their stories. But when we kind of think back to narrative change and how we're changing what the thought about higher education, where, you know, it used to just be go to school, get your degree, but now it's go to school, they need to provide some health care, we need to have a food bank. I'm talking about California, that's where I live, guys. So, you know, it's really because we're shifting the narrative of what the systems of higher education can do and can be responsible for. So we can create a movement by young people and with young people by making space for young adults. Far too often we have these conversations, we write these reports, and we haven't talked to one single person who's in college right now. And those times need to end. We have to stop doing that if we want to create a movement where young adults feel invested. And once we can get people invested in their own issues and there's some self-service here, that's how we start to create real change. And when it goes to the policymakers, those same young adults are constituents. And so we're providing another service, the service of self-actualization and civic involvement, right? Where they can talk to the policymakers, the elected leaders, and tell them about their experiences, share their stories, and drive real policy change. And we've seen it happen a lot of times, even with our quest to cancel student debt. You know, a lot of people don't know this, but Young Invincibles has been advocating for debt cancellation for 10 years now. 10 years and 3 presidents. And so we were finally able to get presidential candidates to use student debt cancellation as a part of their platform. And we even had a president agree to cancel student debt. That wasn't an accident, right? That was years of amplifying the voices of students, amplifying the voices of student borrowers, meeting with policymakers, and really changing the narrative of, you know, not too long ago, you had a whole country saying, if you sign the paper to go to college, you're supposed to deal with it on your own, to people saying, well, actually, this does seem like a systemic issue that policy can solve. And so that's really the same formula that we need to do when we think about overall affordability and higher education's role in the racial wealth gap, what we can do to kind of improve these issues.
Thank you, Kristen.
Yeah, so the underlying question is, how do you bring in a variety of these constituencies that we're talking about? And I think relationships are still critical in bringing a variety of folks together in the same place. For example, again, we're doing this at the national level, but you still have to have hyper-local conversations
That's right.
in your states, in your communities, and being in relationship with folks. If you're I'm a Texas native. If thinking about all of the HBCUs in Texas or all the community colleges in Texas, are you all in conversation with one another? Are you having conversations with other presidents or with other leaders of organizations? We're not working on issues that are so radically different that we shouldn't be talking and learning from one another. I'll say convening in the same room is not sufficient, right? You should have structure and strategy and think about sort of how to facilitate that well, but it is a start, right? That the hyperlocal and these national conversations are both critically important and both have to happen on the same time. I think the other thing I'll say is, like, we talk a lot sort of across the network around the importance of clarity of strategy and what does it look like to be in a relationship with policymakers. If you've ever worked in politics or around politics, the reality is it's not very hard to schedule a meeting with your state or local representative. And so as organizations, I know many of we are not always advocacy organizations, but they're learning conversations. There are spaces to invite folks. There are spaces to show up and tell folks about what we're doing. And so even on the policy front, whether that's the federal, state, or your local level, I think there's a role for organizations or leaders inside of organizations to be more intentional about creating space to have conversations with policymakers, because it's a part of their job, and they often love to, and they're often constituent services, and it's not a big deal, and it doesn't take very much time. It's easy to schedule those appointments. And so I think sort of as one small nugget of creating space for deep learning, even across differences.
Thank you, Philip. And Charles, I'd love to give you a chance to talk about this, because we're talking about policy and practitioners, and what does it look like to have that meaningful conversation with college leaders, faculty, Kristen talked about students, and policymakers to deepen the commitment to getting the job done? Because this isn't a new topic, these are not new problems, right? What is it going to take in this movement to have that collaboration with policymakers and practitioners in order to really advance the meaningful change we're looking for?
Yeah, so I mean, I guess I'd start by underscoring or underlining what Philip just said, because, you know, I that's just so true. I mean, I don't know what everybody's experience is in dealing with your state legislators, but in my experience, they're like, oh my God, somebody's talking to me, somebody's actually reading my stuff, somebody's actually at these hearings. These are generally lonely things, and you have tremendous outsized power by showing up, especially if you show up in coalition with partners who are willing to make that change with you. And that ends up, frankly, probably being the way to move federal levers too, because that's the minor league team for what ends up being the federal game later on, right? So I would start with, showing up to these empty hearings and to these state offices because they're, hopefully thrilled to hear from you. The second thing I would say in terms of, there has to be a shift. I think Kristen was alluding to this in the media attention around higher education. This was certainly brought up by one of the presidents in the panel this morning. I mean, at the end of the day, whenever we're talking about higher education, whenever you see it in the New York Times or in USA Today or in the LA Times or the Economist, it's always, right now it's Harvard, MIT, and Penn. And before that, it was, affirmative action. I'm not saying that affirmative action is not important, right? But the thing is, 7% of colleges are 50% or more selective, and they're dominating about 98% of the attention economy. Then meanwhile, 93% of colleges, and the ones that are the social mobility engines, are hardly getting any attention at all. And we need to shift that because I think higher education, and I know CCA, I know myself especially, also calls out wherever there's, really big weaknesses in college completion. But a lot of that has to do with, yes, we can, continue to improve our practices for sure. But a lot of it has to do with the fact that elite colleges, on the one hand, receive 4 times more per student relative to the 93% colleges. And then the second thing is that they're just failing us on the main stage, and that's just killing higher ed's image for everybody. So I think that there needs to be an effort that's, it's almost like a lane that's running at the same time that we're running down the lane with our state policymakers to have a really smart and intentional media and communication blitz. There are certain messages that are proven to resonate better with constituents and with voters around public higher education, especially when we emphasize how strong higher ed is in America. We've got the most diverse set of higher education institutions in the world, and we need to be leaning into that more if we're ever going to, if we're going to stop dropping in higher ed attainment internationally.
Thank you, Charles. So I want to move into Future Ready, right? We're here at the Complete College America Future Ready conference. And as I mentioned earlier, and we're all aware, these are not new issues. But when we think about the recommendations that are coming forward in your report and an ability to get the recommendations to really be supported, especially financially supported in our current political climate, what do you propose as a strategy for really thinking about the funding and the longevity of the recommendations in your report? And that's for both of you, but I'll go ahead and start with you, Kristen.
So I'll handle the financial aid side, and you want to do the institutional support?
I was going to do finance. No, I'm kidding. Yeah.
I was about to say, we have a problem. I did just make that up on the fly, though.
Yeah.
That could be happening. So when we think about financial aid, in my opinion, we should think about different approaches federally and statewide. So federally, it's our position to try to, at minimum, double Pell Grant to help the students who need the most help, and also kind of break the reliance on student loan debt because we don't want to continue to dig ourselves into the hole that we're currently in. Also, we're making movements to improve FAFSA to make that more accessible. And some states have even have laws that require FAFSA completion for high school graduation, which is getting money in the hands of students who need it the most. And so that's awesome. There's different state movements to increase state-based aid as well. Again, speaking in California, working every year with the state legislature to increase the number of Cal Grants that are awarded and the amount of Cal Grants that is awarded. And so those types of policy efforts where we're increasing the amount of aid that goes directly to students will help fund more students being able to enter college and have less reliance on student loan debt. I think when we think about this from an advocacy perspective, it makes sense to empower young people to, again, talk to their legislature, their state legislators, and kind of help remove those barriers so that they can feel comfortable and confident speaking with people about the need for increased aid on the college campus level. Again, federally, I would also say we're working on negotiated rulemaking with the Department of Education. So we're still in the fight to cancel some of the student loan debt that folks have accumulated, and also include Parent Plus borrowers and graduate borrowers, because we do want to be able to start from as close to, you know, a blank slate as possible. And so I would say, like, from the aid perspective, that's how we can do it. And there is funding to continue, in California specifically, to increase the Cal grants. It just, I believe budgets are a moral document, and it really takes people like us, like you all, talking to your representatives and letting them know that that's where our priorities are. And it's for the betterment of our community overall. I think, Charles, you said it earlier, like investing in higher education invests in the community overall. And so we need to make sure that our elected officials know that those are our priorities. So increasing Pell Grant, your state-based grant, and reducing reliance on student loan debt.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think, you know, I guess, well, so first, I mean, I'll just underscore, I mean, I think, you know, there's a huge link between, you know, we talked about this in another session, but, you know, I think it's, you know, really important to call out, there's a huge link between higher education and the future of democracy, right? Because if you can't afford an education, if the student share of the proportion of revenue, if the student share of institutional revenue has doubled over the last 40 years, if the Pell Grant has a third of its purchasing power, and at the same time we're all up here on stages after stages throughout this convening saying nothing's mattered, the college degree has never mattered more, which is true, that feels like a rigged system. And then that leads to not trusting institutions, not trusting public institutions, that leads to not voting, that leads to not civically participating. It's the exact same finding that, you know, has been found elsewhere, where if you get pulled over by the police, even if you're not brought in, even if you're not arrested, you're not more likely to vote. You know, if we're not funding higher education to meet the missions that governors and legislators are saying that they're set to meet, if we're making it a rigged system, then it's not going to be a shock when voting turnout continues to drop, right? On the student success front of that, right, I think that I guess I would hit on three things. So one is I'll just go ahead and advocate for the Complete College America pillars, because again, you know, we don't have time or room for unforced errors given what the media narrative is, right? Like, you know, having, you know, such bad transfer systems across the country, such poor data across most states, still having prerequisite-driven remediation in some states where it's welcome to college, hey, take some high school again, and we're not gonna count it to college, but it will eat your financial aid. Like, these are things that just like contribute to that same narrative of a rigged system, right? So we've gotta like get rid of these unforced errors and make sure that more students are graduating. Then, as you know, Kristen was alluding to at the end there, then we actually have to fund to that, right? So, you know, again, I'm belaboring the point, but I mean, you know, if you know, Katie Hobbs has a goal for Arizona to do 65 by 25, what does that actually cost? What's the budgetary framework? I'm not saying that that's easy, even if it is, you know, I think logically the most simple thing in the world. It'll be hard to figure that out, but let's start doing an analysis. What's the cost per graduate if we were modeling out the efficiencies that would be required and implied in the CCA pillars, in other administrative efficiencies and academic efficiencies, such that, you know, we're not always focused on how the statewide budgetary pie is sliced, but on the size of the pie. And then finally, like, again, like I think, you know, I'm speaking out of both sides of my mouth because clearly, like, colleges could be more efficient, but like states could be more efficient. You know, you know, allocating your money is an efficiency statement. You know, if your corrections money is going up and your money for post-secondary is going down, well, that says what you want your labor economy to be, right? So I think that we need to be a lot more mindful too in making that argument and making broader arguments about tax policy within higher education, so that way we can build coalitions beyond higher ed. And then that kind of leads to the third point, which goes back to the first, which is civic learning and democracy engagement. Like, because if we're able to do all those things, then when higher ed works, we know that college completers are more likely to vote. We know that they are more likely to have strong health outcomes. We know that they are more likely to be civic participants. And so we need to make sure that not only do we do it for those benefits, but that we also state those benefits, so we break down the false dichotomy between the skills that are required for citizenship and those that are required for the workforce, as they are the same.
Thank you, thank you. So we've been talking about the work that's before us, and I wanted to give Philip a chance to talk a little bit more about the Higher Ed Equity Network as a collective impact network in order to sustain the conversation and to advance the work. What's before us in terms of securing funding and deepening our reach, especially as we advocate on behalf of these students?
Yeah, it's a great question. Couple of thoughts here. One, our original funding was from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation as seed funding to be able to set up the network. Since then, some funding has come in from Trellis Foundation and we have started as a network deep conversations around what, again, long-term sustainability and scaling looks like. And so grateful for those folks who said, like, yes, I'm in, yes, I believe in the network, yes, I believe in a collective, and yes, I believe in these leaders who are coming together, particularly leaders of color and women in leadership who have a vision for what the future of education can look like. At the same time, when we think about the funding landscape, funding collectives are hard, and I'll say why. There's sometimes the myth is that if funder or the funding community funds a collective, then that collective will eventually cannibalize the organizations that are part of collective. I think that's false. I think funding community should and can do both. When you strengthen the collective, again, you add value to the individual organizations who are part of that. And so when we are having this conversation, I think part of it is also just of an education around how collective impact works, why it matters, and how you can do both. Also, sometimes there's this idea, or at least in the sector, to say the sector is inefficient. Then if the sector is inefficient, then why don't you fund collectives that are bringing people together, again, with very, very clear strategies, like working, have clear goals, have clear methods, have clear approaches. I'm not talking about any one funder, I'm just talking about sort of the field as a whole. And so I think a part of our work is being in conversation with people who also believe that focusing on racial equity as it relates to higher ed is really, really important. But I think a part of our work is also educating the field around how this works, why it matters, what our operating model is. And then maybe the third point here is that for many of you, you've probably had conversations around the differences between trust-based philanthropy and strategic philanthropy. And the idea, again, strategic philanthropy means it aligns with the specific goals of a funder, where trust-based says these folks on the stage, again, can think about what needs to happen in the field and put up action plans and action agendas to be able to get to their end goal. So it'll also push the funding community to think about how they incorporate elements of trust-based philanthropy as a part of their work. Again, collective impacts, they cost money, they cost time. Again, there's only so much that in terms of asking all of the the many, many hours we ask from our members. Again, we also don't want to ask for free labor, and we want to support them to be able to show up and be at the things they need to be and use their expertise around these very hard, complicated topics like equitable investment and bringing these ideas together. And so those are the conversations that the network's having across the field, but also making sure we're understanding where there are opportunities or where there are opportunities to be opportunistic about areas that we're already working on that align with an area that a funder wants to support. Again, at the same time, there's still going to be the core work that may not it may be in the early phase as the funding community sees it, but we still see it as a critical element for being able to solve some of these problems. And so I think for us, it's likely going to be a both and. That's a long answer, but maybe there's like one more thing to call out here is that I failed to mention many of the folks who are in this room who are part of the Higher Ed Equity Network. Again, for example, Askew is sitting in front of us, our colleagues from VentureWell, our colleagues from AHEC, one of our colleagues from Campaign for College Opportunity, our colleague from Friday Consulting who is helping us with some of our strategic communications work. Again, it takes a lot of people and a lot of types of expertise and skill, and they are also donating their time and their resources to be able to make this work. And so I'm saying that to say that fundraising can come from sort of funding sources like foundations, et cetera, but also one of the ways that collective impact works is that folks who are at those organizations are also giving something of themselves because they believe in this work and in this mission. So.
Thank you, Philip. And we want to transition to Q&A, and I didn't give you all the speech that you might have received this morning about a threat looming if you didn't have questions. But if you do have questions, please raise your hand, and I want to give Kristen and Charles just a chance to have some closing thoughts while we have you all raise your hand for questions. So we'll start with you, Kristen.
So a couple of things have come to mind. Philip, when you were talking, without the Higher Education Equity Network, products such as compounding inequities wouldn't exist. And it has created a platform for organizations like CCA and Young Invincibles to work together in a way that we never have before, and I think that's very valuable. I also just wanted to say before we ended, Charles actually sparked this when he was talking about all of the intersections between health outcomes and civic involvement in higher education. And so I just wouldn't feel comfortable without leaving to say, before we named the paper Compounding Inequities, I wanted to name it Fixed. And I think what Charles was saying really kind of ties it all together, that when we have racialized groups being burdened by all of these policy barriers for accessing higher education, it's not only, it doesn't only stop them from obtaining a degree, it impacts all of these other things in our lives, including being able to create generational wealth, but also very important, stopping us from becoming an educated voter body. And so when we put all of these things together, it just really continues to demonstrate how important it is that our higher education system is accessible to anyone who wants to enter it.
Charles?
So I just wrote down just a few things that I don't think that we touched on that I just want to make sure we hit. So I don't know if there are funders in the room either way. Go tell them later. But the research into this that needs to continue, right? So, we talk about lowering tuition and increase institutional support and the need to improve college completion. We need to do research that makes these things talk to each other more, right? So how much student success improvement do you see in retention, in credit accumulation, and in gateway course pass rates when you look at tuition as a student success intervention? So let's say reducing tuition by $10 per credit hour versus hiring 200 more advisors, or whatever it is. Like, what would it look like to quantify these reforms against each other so we can continue to bring the affordability and success conversations even closer together? Similarly, on the research front, I think looking at, there's been a lot of studies that are looking at adequate funding of higher education, looking at cost per enrollee, what would look like as cost per graduate. It's a different tweak, but it's essentially the same study, different elements, different unit of analysis. Data, I think that we need to invest more in data systems. California is clearly doing that, but data is a democratic thing too, because when you're trying to understand student reality and you're trying to improve it, you want to make sure that you're not pedestaling your own experiences, your own anecdotes. You want to be able to capture all students in terms of your analysis for how you're improving student reality, and so we need to be like really mindful of how we're doing that and leveraging it to tell our stories. The last thing is, so we're, this is the Higher Education Equity Network, 34 organizations. There's lots of organizations in this room that may not be part of it. There's individuals who may not know how to become a part of it. Just like what we were saying, what Philip mentioned, what I reiterated around like state legislators just love it when you go talk to them, because nobody, if you were to say, I want to get involved in the Higher Ed Equity Network and I don't, like this sounds awesome, like what can I do, what should I do, like just talk to us, like it's that easy, and then we'll figure it out.
Thank you. So are there any questions? You can raise your hand, stand up. Questions?
Probably not. Charles and I did an amazing
Yeah, that's
job.
true.
That is true. That is true. That is true.
I'll say for our own liking, we've been in a few sessions. All of us have been in sessions in and out these last couple of days, and I haven't seen any questions being asked yet. And so I'm hoping that this group can be the first group that I've seen ask a question. And so for the sake of our happiness and for us
There
to
they go.
thank you. All right, hold on.
Oh, you guys fell for
You
it.
got it. Cool. Thank you for hearing me. Here you go.
Always happy to make you happy. Just curious, like, what do you see for the network over the next 2 years in terms of your priorities now that you have the report out?
Yeah. I think so. Two levels of this is that, again, earlier I mentioned how we're aligning, how we're amplifying work, and how we're mobilizing across a specific action agenda. And so I think our streams of work in terms of the issues will likely be around transfer and credit mobility with the racial equity lens. It will likely be around what is our role in some of the anti-DI legislation and supporting institutional leaders, but also what are the ways that states or folks who are working at the state in the education departments can approach this in a way that has the least amount of harm for students. I imagine we're going to spend a whole lot more time on this work around equitable investment. I think we will talk a lot more around data and how that data sort of is a through line between many of these challenges in higher ed, and specifically around how institutions use that, again, to improve areas around career outcomes. I think we also leave room for us to address needs as they come up in the field. I think there's a certain amount where we say, like, we have to make some choices about our strategy, but there's this other side that says, like, we want to be nimble and responsive when really important issues come up. We want to be able to communicate about things and share a perspective when challenges come up that are less foreseen. And so we'll likely continue to convene together. We'll likely continue to put out some reports. We're likely to continue to think about, again, what policy change looks like in all of our work, really connecting to some of the policy and practice changes across those areas, federal, state, but also at the institutions. And so if you ask me sort of 3 years from now, I hope there are a handful of wins across many of those verticals that are aligned with this greater theory change. And the reality is that it does take a long time to do collective impact work. It does take a long time to have the scale that we are talking about. But in the meantime, I imagine we're going to be more organized. We're going to be more coordinated. We'll be a little bit larger. We'll be a little more well funded, and we will have clarity about how the different organizations utilize their strengths and skill sets to be able to connect back to the work. And so that is sort of more broad and maybe not to your specific question around sort of equitable investment, but I think that's how we're thinking about sort of the larger body of work.
Can I add one thing to that?
Please.
I'll speak on behalf of CCA, and I hope, Philip, you agree, but this is, where I also hope the network goes is, I think about the work of our committee and how we're producing this report. I'm hoping that the next couple of years, like I see Chris and stuff, on social media, it's like, we're all on the Capitol today, like we're on the steps of the Capitol, we're at the Supreme Court. I'm like, damn, like, and I want to see like us act more in coalition to do the activism that the reports serve as anchors for. And again, I think that's just like another way we can be greater than the sum of our parts. And I bet it's going to follow that sort of order, because first you need these anchor points and the designs and the models and the common ideas that we're going at things with. But then, when we're actually pushing folks, that we can do that together as well.
That's right.
I would also add, one of the things that is core to our work is making sure that those that are committed to the work have the resources they need. This is not easy, or we'd have solutions. And so part of what we do at HEEN is really talk about how do we put forward, Kristen mentioned putting students at the table so we understand their needs, but we're also trying to collect the resources and disseminate those resources to support those very students. And all students aren't the same, and so a large part of what we're trying to do is equip the field to be able to tackle the challenge of supporting racial equity in higher education. Was there one more question? We have 2 minutes.
There was one over there.
Yes. So, I think she's bringing you a microphone.
I will yield to Tarek Tidwell, given that I only raised my hand so that my good friend Philip can continue to feed me.
Yay!
Make sure he stayed happy.
That was your question?
No.
Okay. So, very interesting conversation happening as we came in about closing the equity and wealth gap, racial wealth gap, and some of the things that we just was talking about, which is like where some of the institutions are and some of the students and success is not just quantifiable by graduation, but also by the creation of wealth. And in the last 10 years, we see 20 institutions that their alumni or graduates have went on to raise more than $500 billion of wealth. So we think about in terms of like closing the racial wealth gap and thinking about where can we see the notion of supporting institutions to prepare their students to be future ready, which is in the creation of these kinds of either inventions, technologies, because that's really the transformational piece of like where we see the whole racial and wealth gap, which is around supporting innovators, supporting institutions to create those innovators to help close the racial wealth gap. So just curious about where the network and some of the other areas of this engagement might be in the next 3 to 5 years.
In terms of
Supporting higher education in racial wealth gap closure.
Yeah, I can start. I mean, I'm hoping that a lot of what this committee worked on, starting with this report, but obviously, using that as only the beginning and the anchor point with that is, the idea is that higher education is supposed to help, and it can't do everything, but it's supposed to help close the racial wealth gap, right? And so we, and right now higher ed in many ways is exacerbating it. And I think that by promoting, a lot of the policies that we talked about in terms of affordability, access, success, post-completion success, that makes a dent. And I would also be remiss, on our committee, we have a very active member from the Institute for Higher Education Policy, right? And their post-secondary value commission, the framework that they have, holds institutions to a pretty intelligent target around, well, what would it take to, because you can't income your way out of it, right? And it's like, well, if you, what would it take in terms of the median earnings threshold to actually to actually close that gap? And they have that as threshold 5. If you Google post-secondary value explorer, like that's what it would take. And looking at what it would take to get institutions to this 5th threshold beyond this base median earnings threshold to really start making a dent for higher ed to really truly do its part. And I think that we need more research too into how to make that dent. But hopefully, the spirit and the recommendations of the report are addressing exactly what you're asking, and hopefully that's like the point of the whole network. Do you have any?
Well, what I was thinking when you were asking the question, I know we're at time, but I immediately went to, are we even collecting the correct data to capture if folks are attaining the wealth that they should be with the college degree? I know the answer to that is no. So that was kind of a rhetorical question, I suppose. But really, I think, to answer that question, we would have to take it back a few, take it back a few steps, that we don't capture the information that we need to capture to even know the point that we're starting from. So it's a lot of assumption, right? We also know when we're talking about racialized groups that our median income is lower, so like we know we're starting from a different point. So to me, I would immediately just go to, we have to advocate for better data systems across our institutions and our state so that we can collect this information and then to start to have intelligent policy recommendations based on that.
Thank you for your time. Please join me in thanking the panelists.
Do
Thank
the
y'all.
podcasters want us?
Please make sure that you complete the evaluation that's in your app and enjoy lunch.
Oh, yeah, yeah.